Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. Welcome to another in my series of Mount Rushmore videos. 4 games for a specific console that are the most iconic for the console. 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, 4 great presidents on Mount Rushmore. So we're talking 4 great games for the console that must also be famous, emblematic of that console, and just absolutely iconic. Today we're covering the Atari 2600. And yes, my first pick is Pitfall. So let's get to it. Now you guys know I love the Atari 2600, and a game I hear about probably more than any other, like if I'm just at retro gaming cons or stores and I'm just talking up the good old days of Atari 2600 era, Pitfall. I'll probably hear about that more than just about any other game for the console. And now this is purely anecdotal, but it was an amazing popular game, an incredible game, and it was so freaking ahead of its time. It's got walking animations, you're swinging on vines, it's Pitfall Harry, you're jumping over obstacles, just so revolutionary. It sort of helped pioneer the platforming genre. Now, the game doesn't scroll. It pioneered the side-scrolling platformer genre, even though it doesn't scroll, or at least helped pioneer this genre. When you go from screen to screen, the screens load one at a time, but it sort of has that side-scrolling platformer type of gameplay. Now, like Adventure and Superman, it doesn't scroll, but like those 2 games, it's revolutionary, and it has a lot of adventure elements, and it did just pave the way for a ton of side-scrolling platformers to follow. Just an amazing game. It constantly shows up on best of list for the Atari 2600, and a lot of people cite this game as one of the best games of all time, maybe top 10 or top 20. It is a phenomenal game that holds up well today. Now sure, it's a little clunky compared to something like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario Brothers, but hey, it's a great game, and it's still fun, still challenging, and it's got that just great sense of adventure and exploration, non-linear. Excellent game, Pitfall. It's one you hear about for the 2600 over and over again. It definitely falls on the Mount Rushmore of Atari 2600 games. Just when it came out in 1982, absolutely revolutionary, still amazing today. Next up, now I have cited this game often as my favorite game for the console. Now, when it comes to the 2600, there are several games I consider my favorite, or at least in the running for my favorite. Games like River Raid and Demon Attack and a few others, but holy cow, I like Space Invaders. Yes, I'm a big shooter fan. And Space Invaders is one of the best. The arcade version came out in 1978. It absolutely revolutionized the coin-op industry, and it was revolutionary not only in the arcades, but also for the home. As a matter of fact, I did a video on Space Invaders in general saying it is the most revolutionary video game in the history of the industry for what it did for the arcades and the 2600. I remember playing the arcade version for the first time in '78 when it came out in a small town called McGregor in Texas, next to, near Waco, and I was just mind blown. And I was almost equally mind blown when it came out for the 2600 in 1980. It looked great, it sounded great. Now, it's not a note-for-note arcade port, but this is actually a good thing in this case because it has a ton of options. It's really incredible. Moving shields, zigzagging laser bombs, invisible invaders. As a matter of fact, when Space Invaders first came out for the 2600, I was a little tired of the arcade version. I'd played it to death, and it was refreshing to have all these new features. I played it at my friend's house in 1980. Finally got it for myself in 1982 when I first got my 2600, but I played the heck out of Space Invaders at my cousin's house, friends' houses. Loved this game. It was the first officially licensed arcade port for a home consoles. Yes, there were ports for the Atari 2600 before Space Invaders, but they were just unlicensed knockoffs. Like Outlaw was based on Midway's Gunfight, and there are several others. But Space Invaders was the first officially licensed one. It's considered the first killer app for a home console. It quadrupled sales for the 2600. It was the best-selling Atari 2600 game until Pac-Man came along. Now, Pac-Man, is that one of the most iconic games for the 2600? Maybe, but it's not great, at least objectively, as far as arcade ports go. And so no, it did not make the list. I will have a list of honorable mentions at the end of this video, so please hang on for those. Space Invaders for the 2600 absolutely belongs on the Mount Rushmore. It's so emblematic of the console. It's so great. It's so iconic, so famous. Absolutely a no-brainer. I can't see how you would argue with this one, but feel free to comment and let me know if you think it shouldn't belong. You're welcome to that opinion. All right, guys, next up, I don't think you'll have too much problems with this one either. Adventure. Just a revolutionary game again, another cutting-edge, groundbreaking game for the 2600. Like Pitfall, it influenced a ton of games. It came out in 1980, and there's certainly more famous games on the 2600, like Frogger, Dig Dug, you know, some of these games that everybody knows. Adventure, you kind of have to be a little bit involved with gaming to know what adventure is, or at least have you know, read Ready Player One or watched the movie. Anyway, it's not as famous as something like Space Invaders, but it's an incredible game, and it is absolutely emblematic of the 2600. It's hard, if you're a real Atari 2600 fan, I don't want to say real fan, you can be a casual fan, you can be whatever kind of fan you want, but most people that are really into the 2600 love adventure, or at least have a great deal of respect for it. It's got an open-ended environment, which is unusual for the time. It's got enemies that move when they're off the screen, which is just, you know, for 1980, wow. There's a randomized location of objects in the third difficulty setting. Just absolutely revolutionary, and that's part of what makes the game a challenge in that third setting. If you want to beat the game pretty easily, play difficulty 1. Now, Warren Robinett designed Adventure as sort of a graphical take on Colossal Cave Adventure, that revolutionary, you know, really early text adventure game for home computers. Now, speaking of Warren Robinett, he was frustrated by the fact that Atari programmers didn't get much, you know, publicity or much acclaim or even much money, relatively speaking, for the games that they would program. So he wanted a little notoriety, or at least subtly so. He programmed the first widely known Easter egg in a video game. He hid his name in a secret room in Adventure. Now, some people call this the first Easter egg in a video game, but there was one, at least one before that. One for the Fairchild Channel F, but that's a story for another day. Adventure, you know, just, you cannot hardly think of the Atari 2600 without Adventure popping in your mind, and it did influence a ton of games. And, you know, would we have Legend of Zelda today without Adventure? I don't know, maybe. Adventure sort of helped popularize and help move the industry towards more open-ended games, deeper games. It sort of got the industry thinking in this direction, at least, you know, a very early example of this kind of game. Obviously, you see games today that are open-ended, that are open world, that are, you know, adventure games, non-linear, and you're searching for items, you're going on quests. Adventure was an early version of that, absolutely influential. Adventure. Hard to argue with this one, guys. Now, next up, it's actually hard to argue too. These 4 picks were pretty obvious to me. Now, you might have some different choices, and I'll get to those in just a minute. Some that could qualify, or if there were 5 or 6 presidents on Mount Rushmore, maybe they would slip in, but we'll get to those in a minute. And I think you know what I'm talking about here. Combat. 1977 obviously was the pack-in title for the console. Just about every 2600 owner has played this game since it was the pack-in with the console, at least the first pack-in, and for many years of the pack-in. Later, Pac-Man replaced it. But Combat is pretty much a perfect 2-player game, kind of like Pong. You can't argue with just the perfection of the mano-a-mano action. It's even, you know, the best player is typically gonna win unless, you know, the weaker player gets lucky or whatever. In other words, one player doesn't have a fair, you know, an unfair advantage over the other just because of how the game is set up. It's very equal the way it's designed. Just a great 2-player game. It's perfectly balanced. And back in the 90s and the early 2000s, when I was, you know, just hardcore game chasing, game hunting, you know, going to pawn shops, thrift stores, flea markets, copies of Combat were everywhere. Anytime you saw, you know, like you'd go to the pawn shop and they'd have a 2600 with a bunch of games. Usually they had a bunch of copies of Combat, and it was just everywhere. It got to be a joke. As a matter of fact, it actually hurt the reputation somewhat. People would see so many copies of Combat, they sort of started resenting the game. They'd be looking for games and wanting to collect games, wanting to fill in holes in their collections. Yes, there was a growing community of collectors in the 90s, thanks to the advent of eBay and, online message boards and this kind of thing and fanzines. And, there started to be a community in the late 90s with conventions and a lot of, game talk, a lot of game collecting talk. And it was definitely a thing that Combat was all over the place. If there were memes back then, Combat would have been one of them, as far as just seeing it everywhere. And that kind of made people think the game, this Combat sucks, it's everywhere, but it's actually an amazing game. I have great memories of playing Combat with my friend Mike Mall. He was a good friend of mine that was a transplant from New York, and he heavily resented having to move to Texas. He loved living in, Brooklyn. I think it was Brooklyn he lived in. But anyway, he lived in one of the boroughs, one of the thrive, just major hardcore downtown, just Chinese restaurants open at 4 in the morning, that kind of thing, New York City. And he did not like living out in the more open-ended part of state of Texas, and where things are a lot different here, where you have to have your own car and that kind of thing. Anyway, getting way off tangent, but I have great memories of playing Combat with Mike Mall at his house, and Atari definitely helped him adjust to living somewhere else. He loved his 2600. He got one well before I did, and I would ride my bike over there and maybe made a nuisance of myself. I don't know. We always had a great time playing Combat and listening to Air Supply, of all bands. Scoff if you will, but Combat and Air Supply go very well together. Just a phenomenal game. It's hard to argue with Combat. Just so many great options, so many great variants. Just a tremendous game, regardless of which variant you choose. The tanks, the planes, you name it. Phenomenal game. Combat, absolutely emblematic of the 2600. Iconic, famous, you name it. It belongs on the Mount Rushmore of Atari 2600 games. Now, here are some others that you might take under consideration. Now, Pac-Man, I really enjoy Pac-Man. And I actually think it's a great maze game just to play. It's great fun, I'll put it that way. But it's a lousy port, obviously, and it didn't quite make the cut. It's definitely an iconic game. It's the top-selling 2600 game of all time. It's one of the most famous video games, just Pac-Man in general, in the history of the world. So how could it not be on the Mount Rushmore? Because I'm thinking of games that are emblematic, which the 2600, which this hits, but it also has to be great, and a lot of people hate this one, and so it doesn't quite make the cut. Miss Pac-Man almost made the cut, but hard to put it above these other fours. It's more iconic. It would be on the Mount Rushmore of arcade games for sure. Classic arcade games. You'd have Miss Pac-Man and Galaga and a couple others. So yeah, Miss Pac-Man didn't quite make the cut. River Raid, wow. I just couldn't put it ahead of Pitfall or these others. Great game, one of my favorite shooters of all time. Yar's Revenge has grown over the years as far as people loving that game, and phenomenal. Didn't quite make the cut. E.T. the Extraterrestrial is not a great game, although some people think it's very good if they actually read the instructions and figure out how to play. I think it's solid. Didn't make the cut though, but it's definitely iconic. Frogger, Asteroid, Centipede, Missile Command. These are all iconic games. Those are great games, those I mentioned. But these 2600 arcade ports, a lot of them are great, but they're not quite as emblematic as Combat, Adventure, Pitfall, or Space Invaders. So let me know in the comments where I went wrong. What do you think the Mount Rushmore of Atari 2600 games should be? Remember, famous, iconic, emblematic of the 2600, and great. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of my Mount Rushmore series here. I really appreciate it, and we will talk to you in another video.
It's me, Mario!